Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Bridget Anderson, the President and CEO of the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade. And welcome to our Business Resiliency Series, Navigating COVID-19. Today, we'll be focusing on adaptive leadership in the face of crisis. In this time of unprecedented uncertainty, we want to make sure that our members and the broader business community can find answers to their most pressing questions. Through a series of free webinars, experts will provide guidance and answer questions to help companies navigate these very challenging times. We encourage you to take part in this discussion. You can engage with us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram using the hashtag GVBOT. And we're also using Slido for today's discussion to allow you to submit questions. You can do this in your internet browser by going to slido.com, and you need to enter the code GVBOT Leader. Now, before we start, and especially in these challenging times, we want to thank our long-standing sponsors called our Pillar Partners. They include TELUS, YBR, CN, BCIT, and Air Canada. We are very grateful for the support of these 5 organizations whose annual partnerships and commitments enable the work of the Board of Trade. This webinar is delivered in partnership today with UBC Sauder Executive Education. And a thank you to our preferred media partner, Business in Vancouver. Today, we are joined by UBC Sauder Executive Education Instructor, CEO and co-founder of the Gamar Leadership Group, Adel Gamar. Gamar Leadership Group is a boutique management consulting firm specializing in adaptive leadership, organizational strategy, and change management. Adel is driven to forge effective collaborations among business, government, and nonprofit sectors while creating lasting and impactful solutions. Adel, I'm going to get you to kick things off with a short presentation, and then we'll get straight to the Q&A. Over to you, Adel.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I want to thank you, Bridget, for your leadership and commitment to the business community during this pandemic. These Business Resiliency Series are so vital for sharing critical insights as we all try to navigate through these really disorienting times. A big thank you to you and your team for bringing us together today. A special thank you to all of you on this webinar. I was just updated that we have approximately 850 participants that have registered for this webinar. And so it is truly my pleasure to be with you today. I know we're all hunkered down, living in physical isolation while trying to remain socially connected. Some of us are living in quarantine, others are on the front lines. Our healthcare professionals, first responders, grocery store employees, my heart goes out to all of you during these extraordinary times. I hope you and your family and friends are all in good health. Over the next 7 to 8 minutes, what I hope to do is to explore with you 3 foundational concepts from the adaptive leadership framework to help launch our conversation this afternoon. Can we please have the first slide? So first question that people ask is, so what is adaptive leadership? Essentially, it is a framework, a toolkit, if you may, or a tool that you can put in your toolkit. It started with some of the seminal work from Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky, 2 colleagues over at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. It amounts to about 35 to 40 years of the art and practice of leadership. It is seen as leadership is an exercise that one does, that there's no perfection essentially. It is a process of learning. It is a process of being as an artist, throw paint on the wall, step back and observe what's working and what's not. It is practical in that it helps organizations adapt to uncertain times, implement systemic change at the organizational level, and help build capacity in people. The framework has been utilized through the tri-sectors, so governments, nonprofits, and private sector have implemented, and you've got a list of some organizations that have implemented and utilized the framework in some shape or form. So let's jump right into the framework then. If we can have the next slide. An important distinction within the framework is to separate challenges that organizations and teams experience. On the one hand, there are technical problems, and on the other, you've got the adaptive challenges. Technical problems are clear. They're easy to identify. Usually there isn't a conflict of interest or a disagreement in terms of what the challenge is. They are problems that are very familiar. that might range from simple to complex, but essentially the technical know-how, the expertise will fall under the purview of somebody within the organization. Challenges in the way of a technical problem usually is just time, financing, resources. This here to fulfill or to address a technical problem requires the fulfillment of people of authority, managers, directors, executives, C-suite. An example of a technical problem given where we are today would be, how do you access the funding that was just earmarked by the federal government called the Canada Emergency Response Benefit? Something that a person can learn how to do, navigate through, and access the necessary funds that have been earmarked. Adaptive challenges are different in that they are elusive. They're difficult to identify. If you were to pull in people within your organization and say, what do you think is the adaptive challenge? Most likely you're going to get multiple interpretation on what that challenge is. In that difference of opinion is an example or an indication, if you may, that that's an adaptive challenge. There aren't ready-made answers. It requires not the executive or decision makers, i.e. the technical know-how, to address the adaptive challenge. Rather, it requires multiple levels within the organization, various stakeholders to actually be in that room to make the decision and decide on what that challenge is and how are you going to be able to navigate through this. An example of an adaptive challenge, given where we are right now, is as a business, how do you weather and mitigate the losses through COVID-19 while learning anew and becoming resilient? Unlike the technical challenge of accessing the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, you can see adaptive challenges is how do we become resilient in this new reality we call COVID-19. One of the quotes that I'd love to share with clients and colleagues and students who come through the program at Sauder Exec Ed is, the single biggest failure of leadership is assuming this adaptive challenge is just business as usual and you address it as if it's a technical challenge. And I'm sure that this will create some fodder for our conversation a little later. But I want to shift to the next concept that I want to share with you. And if we can have that slide up, please. It is the concept of the productive zone of disequilibrium. And I don't think any caller or any listener on this webinar would disagree that we are definitely in extraordinary times. The high level of disequilibrium can be seen not only by the day, but by the hour. And so to do adaptive work, unlike technical work, where with technical work, a level of disequilibrium, disorientation, confusion might arise, but with technical know-how, we can bring that level of disequilibrium down. To do adaptive work requires us to raise that level of disequilibrium high enough where we can have what we call the productive zone. This productive zone is critical to last over a duration of time so that real work can happen in addressing the adaptive challenge. New learning will be required. We're asking people to consider bringing in their opinions forward in a time where we don't have clear answers to a problem that we have yet to get our hands around. And so managing that level of disequilibrium is part of exercising leadership, ensuring that the heat doesn't raise to a point where we call the limit of tolerance, where it's chaos and disorganization, but also not to lower it low enough where people are seeing that this is business as usual. On the right-hand column, I share with you some strategies where you can remain in that productive zone of disequilibrium by pulling yourself out of the problem and looking at the system, i.e. getting on the proverbial balcony. Because this is not technical, it's adaptive. You need people in your organization to support and to help and provide perspective, i.e. that's where you seek allies. And you need to give the work back because unlike technical, adaptive requires multiple stakeholders to actually have an opinion and voice their concerns and what is the new learning that is required to be done during this transitional period. Managing or mitigating losses is something that is really important to highlight. We found that people are not afraid of change, but they're afraid of losses, and ensuring how do you mitigate the losses is part of exercising leadership and ensuring that productive zone of disequilibrium lasts long enough that people find some new learning through the process. But it's also important, and I'll highlight the last point here in the strategies, which is that you need to instill inspiration and hope in your teams. That is part of how do we last in this level of this equilibrium where it's productive and new learning is happening. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't highlight the final point, and that's in the next slide. And that is that we need to separate ourselves from our role. Many of you right now are disoriented, as we all should be, given that this is extraordinary time. But to ensure that we last long enough, that be able to actually contribute to our organizations and become resilient, it requires that we take care of ourselves. And to do that, I'm sharing with you 3 concepts, and that is for things that I hope we're putting into practice. One is ensure that you have a place to anchor yourself. That place could be what you call a sanctuary. It could be a forest. It could be a yoga mat. Before COVID-19, it could have been a church, a mosque, a synagogue, a bar where you hang out and get to talk to people. How do you find the sanctuary during this time becomes very critical so that you can continue to do the critical work that you're in charge of doing. The other thing is that we need each other. We need people who will anchor us and become what we call confidants. We can call up on and ask for support. And the final point that I want to make is that we need to have rituals and practices, again, to keep us anchored, to keep this put this into perspective, practices that will slow things down for us, because we all know that these are definitely disorienting times and there's a lot going on that we need to be processing. The greatest significance during COVID-19 is that how do we work from home and continue to manage my business and support my teams? Physical isolation has become very hard for many of us. And so what does that do to not only just being away from people, but not being able to wear a suit and go to work and come home and be with my family for supper? And also, how do you juggle the various roles, being dad, father, but at the same time managing my company? And so I'll leave this here now and hope, Bridget, you can start us off in the conversation and trusting that these 3 concepts of adaptive versus technical, the role of healthy physical disequilibrium, but also separating self and role would generate some conversation.
Thanks very much, Adel. And let's maybe start with some of the benefits of this type of leadership style in times of crises. So given where we are in this pandemic, what is the benefit to utilizing some of these techniques and tools using this leadership style?
That's a really good question. I think it's important, again, to separate challenges by calling them technical and adaptive. And if they are truly adaptive, i.e. systemic, outside of our regular repertoire, it requires new learning. And this new learning could come at a cost for us, because most of us who are high achievers, who've definitely reached high level within our organizations, have gotten there mostly because of our technical know-how, our experiences, our degrees, our life experiences. But when we are faced with adaptive challenges that are systemic, that are even hard to identify, it's sort of liberating to understand that you don't have to do this alone. You need those stakeholders, your allies within your organization, to help you navigate through this. And there are some organizations that have been doing phenomenal work right now. New York Times published an article, I believe 2 days ago, about the medical industry and what was before very protectionist, particularly when it comes to publishing, publish or perish. You've got medical experts who normally would hold on to their information and their genius and know-how. But with COVID-19, they have seen that there's international collaboration, because this is a pandemic and those that are on the front lines are doing every bit they can to be able to collaborate and learn together. I'd love to see that within the business sector, because more than ever right now, there's businesses that are closing down. These are times where people are being laid off, individuals that have been in an organization for dozens of years, and now they're being told, we need to let you go because it makes no financial sense to keep you on. So I think it's critical to be able to see both technical and adaptive challenges, and then know that executives don't have to make the hard call by themselves, but rather engage as many people within your organization to learn anew.
You know, as you mentioned, for a lot of businesses out there, they're just really trying to survive right now. And it really is just a triage approach, if you like. So is now really the right time to be trying a new leadership style in the middle of a crisis?
Yeah. This is not a new leadership style. And I know that there's so much literature out there on leadership. This is a framework that frees up individuals to be able, and again, this is a tool that within a toolkit, so by no means is this gospel. It's something that allows people to be freed up and acknowledge that they cannot have all the right answers and they need each other. I mean, Bridget, more, if you look around you, like you said, the businesses that are closing down, what is it going to mean for a restaurant business that closed down, that if we were to rebound, say in the next 6 months, to be able to make up that lost revenue over the 6 months? How will we as a society be able to, and the word is being tossed around so much, social isolation, which honestly, I'm not a fan of it. We're physically isolating while trying to be socially unified. But what would it look like? What's this landscape after we clear COVID-19, and we will clear it? What would it mean for the business sector if you were a restaurant business, a bar business, where we've now gotten used to being apart? And so the framework acknowledges that if this is a systemic challenge and an organizational challenge, we need to triage it in the next 3 months, 6 months. What is it going to look like for my business to survive? How can I take care of my team? But also, how do I also take care of myself and my family while we are navigating through this uncertain time?
So what are some of the obstacles that businesses or leaders would encounter in using this framework, and how could they overcome them?
It's hard. If we had this conversation before COVID-19, I think that we would be having more of a conversation around who are the stakeholders in your organization, and what are the obstacles within your organization that is inhibiting progress for you to meet your bottom line, but at the same time have a productive environment to work in, to break down silos, to have better communication, better conversation within your organization, so there's productive growth internally. COVID-19 has thrown us all in a whirlwind. What does this mean for my own organization? What does this mean within the sector? What does it mean for the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade to provide services for all of these organizations that are looking to you through these resiliency webinars and resources? How do I make sense of this all? The healthcare system, the federal government, provincial government, municipal governments working together. And so, and I know this has become so, we're regularly saying these times, unprecedented times, and it's fair to acknowledge that regularly, that these are unprecedented times. And so it requires us to be able to try to slow that pace down, where we are asking questions and learning from each other. What would success look like in the next 3 to 6 months? And how could we move forward and be resilient beyond that? Because resilience is not an outcome. And with this framework, it acknowledges that resilience is not an end goal. Resilience is a process, and that process requires new learning. It requires bringing in allies within the organization to have a conversation around what would we need to keep, what do we need to discard, and what would the future look like given this new reality.
And given businesses maybe aren't quite there yet, they might be 1 week away or 1 month away from that, there's still a lot of businesses that are in that triage crisis mode right now. And for some of them, they are having to make incredibly difficult decisions about laying off employees. This framework calls for self-awareness, it calls for trust, but if there is an employer that's having to make those decisions that impact an employee, what would be your advice to that business owner or that leader to ensure that you're not damaging that trust so much that you can get to the point where you're building resilience?
Yeah, such an important question. Going back to the idea that people are not afraid of change, but they're afraid of losses. I don't know many people who would, again, give away a 10% salary increase or a promotion and say, that's change I don't want, or here's my winning BC Lotto ticket, I don't want it. The change that's happening right now are really a lot of losses. People's careers have been compromised, people's expertise and know-how. These are people's salaries that are being lost. And so for business as usual, technical, addressing the fact that your bottom line no longer makes sense, that you need to cut salary or you need to let people off, is assuming that that's a technical challenge. And hence back to leadership failure is assuming adaptive challenges are technical challenges. For executives, business leaders to see this as just a technical challenge, how do I meet my bottom line given this new reality? That's seeing it as a technical challenge. And I'm going to offer is leadership failure. To see this as adaptive in that these are people's lives and I'm investing in my people for the sake of my company is how am I going to mitigate those losses? And to your point, Bridget, it requires to have hard conversations, heart-to-heart conversation of what that reality is.
So how important is vulnerability then in this conversation? Because there's a lot of people who write leadership books and who are leaders themselves talking about coaching and mentoring and being a strong leader. And they say vulnerability is a really key part of that. So in this framework, how important is it?
Very critical, especially when you're talking about disequilibrium at a level writ large in a pandemic. Very critical. And I think that this is part of the liberating aspect of seeing this as an adaptive challenge where I don't have to do this alone. This is systemic. This is beyond business as usual. And so for an executive, a manager, and frankly, even as a parent at home with my children now, being told that this is going to be a homeschooling period when it's not homeschooling, we're in a crisis. And now having to fulfill multiple roles, in fact, we are vulnerable. And one aspect, Bridget, that needs to be discussed is not only, again, this physical isolation or physical separation from people, but what is that doing to our mental health, our well-being? And so if we're not vulnerable now, during this crisis, I don't know when we will become. And so it's critical for executives to expose that vulnerability, but at the same time, not to where I know nothing, because authority does have a role to fulfill. And that's to anchor people, to give them direction, protection, to provide some order, as we see from the Prime Minister in terms of the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. We're seeing it from healthcare professionals. Authority requires us to anchor people, but not to say that I've got all the answers and that I am not vulnerable during this time.
And that's a hard balance for lots of leaders to be able to live in that sweet spot, if you will, of being authoritative and having authority, and also recognizing you don't have all the answers and to lean on people around you and be vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's go to some questions now on our Slido tool. And as we do that, we'll maybe start at the top here because people vote on them. And so this one seems to be quite a popular one. So this is a very good one because we're just talking about being in that sweet spot. So how do you ensure that this framework isn't seen by employees as being indecisive?
Yeah. Again, I think it would have been a different conversation if we did not have the context of COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
COVID-19 is not business as usual. There's nobody in any sector that could clearly identify what tomorrow is going to look like. I believe the latest data is that we've reached over 1 million people who've been affected by this virus. According to Royal Bank of Canada, unemployment rate is going to reach 11% by sometime this next week. And so to be in that authority role and assume that this is just a technical challenge and we need to clear it and business as usual will be, what I'm going to offer is a failure on our part. We need to be able to acknowledge the fact that we don't have the clear answers, but at the same time, provide the critical services that are expected of us, which is direction, order, protection, those critical services that are expected from executives or managers or so-called leaders in their organization.
And I think another thing that's really key is given how fluid this situation is and how rapidly it's evolved, is to be as communicative as possible, which isn't indecisive, but letting people know that the information is constantly changing. The next question here is about the biggest deterrent or obstacle to overcome for someone as they're trying to become a great adaptive leader. So what are those things that people should be watching out for in themselves?
Right. So I'm going to offer that this framework is not about the person. To be an adaptive leader, leadership is an exercise. Authority is not. Authority requires you to fulfill predetermined job descriptions of order, balance the budget, hire, fire, promote, develop a strategic plan, managerial tasks. Leadership, according to the Adaptive Leadership Framework, is an exercise that could be done from whatever position in an organization. It is helping the organization make some progress on an adaptive challenge. And so the biggest obstacle for somebody who wants to help that organization make progress is to see that they are the answer, that they are the solution, that the biggest obstacle for them is just getting everybody on board with what they're saying. That is what you would require from somebody exercising leadership from their technical know-how and their technical genius. But helping an organization make some progress on an adaptive challenge is not about the individual. And so as long as we're putting ourselves in the center, that's going to be a major deterrent to helping the organization build some capacity.
And what about some guidelines then for leaders and within any part of the organization to access if they are adaptive, they're using this framework and they're leading their staff effectively through this pandemic? I'm not sure if you can read that. So do you have any guidelines to use to assess if they are adapting and leading their staff effectively through this pandemic? So how do they assess if they are doing this effectively?
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's critical to bring your stakeholders in, to have that conversation. If you're talking about just from a business perspective, bring in your executive team. Alan Mulally from Ford car manufacturing, he was with Boeing before, but during the Obama administration, GM needed to be bailed out. Ford didn't. And one of the first things that Alan did, which made him such a successful executive, and then he wrote books and now he advises people on, he says that one of the first things that he did was he brought all of his senior executive team together at a particular time. And these are executives across the world at a particular time to have a setting like this, a Zoom meeting. And I don't know if they use Zoom or not, but they met. And he said he required all of them to have a check-in. 10 minutes each. What are you doing? What do you need support from us? And having that task force, if you may, or a group coming together, he said, made that group gel and support each other in ways that they wouldn't have had they been left in isolation and working within their silos. And so a critical component of what leaders ought to be doing during adaptive challenges is you can't do this alone. Bring your key and highlight and identify key individuals that you need to have in that room with you to support you, to pull you on that proverbial balcony and say, boss, CEO, executive, we're in a mix right now and we need each other. And so what's the corrective measure? What are we missing? How do we support each other? These are critical components of exercising leadership, because it's not for the executive to have the final, it's them to have the final decision, but the process requires multiple stakeholders coming together to support each other.
And that sort of answers the top question there. So I'm going to just jump down a little bit and see if you've got any real life examples of adaptive and technical leadership and how adaptive leadership has been applied. Maybe not in this COVID-19 crisis, but broadly, if you've got any examples that you could share with us so people get a better idea of how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I may keep it close to the COVID-19 circumstances, the technical genius that our healthcare professionals are doing right now is just so awesome. They were trained not necessarily to be working within COVID-19, but they're trained to help people. This is technical know-how that we depend on them for their support. The Premier, the Prime Minister, those in positions of authority are providing technical support and giving us support, direction, and honestly instilling some hope in us. These are critical components of addressing technical parts of the challenge. The adaptive part is, how do we clear this and learn new in different ways? And one thing that I have seen done very well, as one example as I was preparing for this webinar, is Lisa Kimmel is the chair and CEO of Edelman Canada and Latin America. And part of their job is to keep people informed about communicating during crises. But what they found is that they needed to also take care of their team. And so as part of their trust barometer, they found that Canadians have high expectations of businesses, particularly during this time, COVID-19. And the high expectation is to be consistent with their information and to be supportive. And so, and I was just looking at this because it just gave me some hope. They started to work internally within their organizations to help their team feel connected. And so they've got hashtag WFH, and I'm assuming that's working from home photos. And so their teams are putting pictures of them, whether they're exercising their yoga or they're sharing recipes. They got pictures with their kids reading books, fun ways of, I'm staying at home, I'm working from home, but this is what my life looks like during this uncertain time. And so it's one way of exercising leadership that could be missed and brushed over to think, oh, that's just really nice and it's fluff. But it's really, we need to be supporting each other. And organizations are looked at by their employees that, how are you going to be supporting me during this tumultuous time? I'm offering that that's an opportunity to exercise leadership. I'll share with you one more. 7 o'clock every night, Bridget. 7 o'clock every night, we hear magic in our neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Who was the one in charge, the responsible one that prompted us to do this? We have no idea who they are. I don't. You might, I don't know. But it's been going on for quite some time, but at 7 o'clock during physical isolation, magic happens in our neighborhoods where we're coming together as community that we've never seen before, at least not in the last decade or so, where we're coming together, banging on pots, acknowledging our healthcare professionals, at the same time expressing our unity through this tumultuous time. That is exercising leadership, bringing people together to make some progress, to make some sense of this extraordinary time.
It certainly is leadership, and it's a great example. I know I've been out on my doorstep many nights at 7 o'clock.
Banging on your pot.
I know, it's great. It's great to feel part of the community doing that. We have time for one last question, and so I want to go to the second one on the screen there. And really, it's about asking what leaders can do to empower team members to grow their adaptive leadership skills. So not how do you grow that culture and that mindset within your own organization?
That is so beautiful, a beautiful question to end on. Again, repeating some of what he said was that with adaptive leadership, executives need to be able to free themselves and to acknowledge that if this is adaptive, it requires me to find allies and to give the work back. And by work back, meaning how do we make sense of this adaptive challenge that we're in? That is liberating, not only for the executive to know, oh, okay, Adel, you just told me that if it's adaptive, I need to bring in my team like Alan Mullally did and ask them, what do you think, what do you need, and what support do you need from me? It's, I think, empowering and liberating. At the same time, you will be surprised when you go to your team, as if you are in that executive C-suite manager, you have direct reports. When you go to them and acknowledge, to your point earlier, Bridget, your vulnerability, that this is this orienting time. This is a time where it's beyond business as usual, it's adaptive. I need your support, your eyes. Tell me where you think we need to make corrective measures. What do we need to keep? What do we need to let go of? And where's opportunities for new learning, innovation? That is the biggest service that you can provide in terms of empowerment your team is to acknowledge that they exist and that their input is critical. particularly during times where it's adaptive, systemic, and complex like these days.
Thank you, Adel. That's some inspiring words to end off our time together. And I really do appreciate your time. And I will listen for you. Might not see you, but I'll listen for you at 7 o'clock tonight on the doorstep. Thanks
Awesome.
a lot.
Well, I want to thank you, if I may, just thank you, Bridget, again, and the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade for the opportunity to be with you. I want to give a shout out to Tia Tablada and Sam Ma, who folks here, the 800 of you don't know, but they're the ones, the tech support in the background, who have been flipping slides and have been really mentoring and supporting me through this process. And so thank you. And finally, thank you to all the participants out there. If your questions weren't addressed, my email address is on the slide deck. I'm happy to share the slide deck with you all. Feel free to email if I could be of any support and answer any questions. I can definitely make sure I get back to you by this weekend or early next week. In the meantime, I wish you all and your loved ones all my best. Be well, and thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Adel, and stay well as well. Now, if you would like to watch this webinar again, you can do so by visiting theboardoftrade.com and going to our COVID-19 page, and it will be uploaded within a matter of hours from now. And we want to continue this important conversation and stay connected. So we are going to continue hosting a series of free webinars on navigating COVID-19. Over the next coming days, we will be bringing together experts to speak on contract performance, e-commerce essentials, and commercial leasing. We have also created a business resource page designed to provide information and toolkits and all of the information you're going to need to navigate the ever fluid situation with COVID-19. And you can find that at boardoftrade.com. And this page will be updated continually as new information becomes available. Thanks to everyone for being part of today's webinar. We look forward to connecting again soon, and to echo the wise words from Dr. Bonnie Henry, Provincial Medical Health Officer: be kind, be calm, and be safe.